Hi y'all, welcome back to Seesaw Art. Let's paint this little street scene with some people in it. I start off on this small 8x8 canvas. I toned the surface of the canvas with yellow ochre and white, and I'm using a small round brush with very thin wash of burnt sienna to sketch the scene. Now I'm doing this painting in acrylics. I'm not being terribly careful with my drawing. I want to be real quick. I wanted to finish this painting in one day. I'm kind of doing a one painting a day challenge thing. Hence the reason for this little small canvas. It's just an 8x8. But also I wanted there to be movement, and I wanted the piece to look kind of happy and free. And so I didn't want to be too tight and specific with the details on this one. So I'm just sketching in with my paintbrush so that my lines aren't, I'm not using a ruler and pencil and all that. If you're not comfortable doing it this way, that's fine. Draw it out, use the grid method, or you could trace it or project it, whatever you feel comfortable with. I put the piano legs in first just to give me a gauge for everything else to be measured off of, so I know how big to make his torso and all that. I think one of the most challenging parts on this was just getting the angle on his leg right, and I may end up having to adjust that a little bit, but this is where it's starting. Now to get this line to connect, even though the man is in front of it, I just go ahead and draw through that. While the paint is still wet, you can just use some clean water on your brush and erase that mark. Now this is the first little additional figure that I'm putting in on this street scene. And once I figure out where the top of where his head is and where his feet go, then you can base your other figures off of it. Basically, to make a figure look further in the distance, all of the heads of all the little figures you put in should be basically on the same level, meaning horizontally across the picture. All the heads are the same level. What varies is where their feet are. So this figure I'm working on in the back, his head is roughly the same level as that first figure, but his feet are a little bit shorter, so he'll look like he's further back. At the beginning of the video, I talked about, using different methods to be able to transfer your drawing onto a canvas. Now, I'm just sketching this in, and I'll be honest with you, a couple of years ago, I would not have been able to do it just, freehand like this. I would have had to draw a grid onto my reference photo and draw a grid onto my canvas and, transfer the drawing that way, or heck, even blowing it up on my printer and then, using tracing paper and trace it onto my canvas. But this just comes with practice and learning to gauge your distances and comparing one object next to another to determine how big to make it. So again, I just want to encourage you, keep practicing. You'll get to that point where you can do this also. Now I'm just putting in some washes of color to establish my darks. I'm also using ultramarine blue to give a little bit of distance, and I'm bluing down, my green foliage. Now I'm using very, very thin layers of paint to do this, almost as if you were doing a watercolor. I've got a big brush and I'm just using the corner of it. Again, the paint is very, very thin because I know I'm going to be building up layers. Even though this is a very small, very simple painting, I still like to have the richness of your colors being layered by using lots of different tones and values. To recap to where we are at this point, the colors I've used so far is yellow, ochre, and white as a background wash over the entire front of the canvas. I sketched in the drawing with very thin wash of burnt sienna. I've added some ultramarine blue and burnt umber for my darks. And I'm using Hooker's green to start putting in some of the green foliage. At this point, it serves our purpose for this style of painting and this particular subject matter with all this foliage to just make your brushstrokes kind of random at this point. Keep in mind very basically where you want your darkest areas to be. And put in some sky holes on your foliage. And I'm just using that ultramarine blue and white to make a real light pale blue. And that's just little bits of sky poking through the leaves of the trees. The reason I chose yellow, ochre, and white as my tone for my canvas is that I think it adds a nice kind of sunny feeling to the whole piece. It will mostly be covered up by our painting on top of it, but there will be just enough to come through that, again, I think it'll make a nice sunny, warm feeling to the whole piece. So the setting for this painting is the Jackson Square in the French Quarter of New Orleans, Louisiana. I've been there many, many times. Love going there. The street musicians are out there, the street painters. It's just a little bit of a carnival atmosphere, but also relaxing at the same time. It's a really lovely place to go and visit. And of course, have beignets and cafe au lait. The colors that I'm using for this paved area is burnt burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and white. And I also used some metallic silver by Golden, and it just makes a little sparkle because it kind of lays over the top of the weave of the canvas, so it's a really nice little effect. Now I'm just adding bits of light and dark to the pavement to indicate dappled sunlight and shadows and so forth. And they really need to be horizontal and level with, the edge of the canvas. So I just for some reason have an easier time doing a straight line if I move my brush up and down versus side to side. So I just turn the canvas on its edge to make those lines. I'm using burnt umber with a tiny, tiny bit of ultramarine blue added to the mix to paint in the piano. So I mixed up a darker version of my gray for blocking in his shirt, and I'm using carbon black for the overturned bucket and his shoe, and just a really dark blue for his pants. Your paintings will always make more sense if you have a very defined source, light source, and in this case, it's coming from the left side of the painting. So, the right side of his body, as we're facing it, here will be darker, and we'll have the highlights more on the left side. So just make variations of the base color that you used and darken and lighten them. And if you wanted, you could put any color shirt on him. Just follow those same principles about darker on one side and lighter on the other. So back towards the beginning of the video when we talked about when you're painting people in your landscape like this or this city scene, that generally the heads of all your people, regardless of how close or far they are from you, that their heads are generally on the same level. And of course, you have to take into consideration there's going to be some variations in the height. So the guy on the left, even though his head is a tiny bit higher than the level of the guy on the right, it's pretty much on par with the piano player. So in my mind, the guy on the left was tall and thin, and the guy on the right was just a little bit shorter. So that's hopefully conveyed, and you can tell what I mean. Now I've added cadmium red medium and raw sienna to my palette to start warming things up a little and adding some variety. So I'm just putting dots of color in the background. It just indicates, I don't know, just stuff. It's nothing in particular. In reality, and in this street scene, there are buildings and, behind the trees that are in that park in Jackson Square. And so there's going to be peaks of color coming through the foliage. And it's fun, just, dabbing in random bits of color. This whole painting is fun. I hope you try something like this. And don't be intimidated by attempting to do people, because as you can see what I've done, it's just, especially the people in the background, it's just kind of generic smudges of color. I'm using this 3/4, 1 inch wide, not sure exactly, substantial for the size of canvas. Just an old scruffy brush to start laying in the foliage a little more definitively than what we've done so far. I'm using my darker colors first, and that would be the hooker's green with either brown or blue or even some of the black in it to darken it. And then we'll go back over it with the highlight colors. So this darker green that we just applied is dry, and I'm going to go back over it now with the lighter green to do our highlights. And I just add some yellow. If you want to see a more thorough video on painting this background foliage, check out my How to Paint a Bougainvillea video. I went over that a lot more in detail than I am in this one. The piano is a big part of the focal point of this painting, so it's important that it looks right, even though this is a somewhat impressionistic and very, relaxed little painting. You still want that part to look right because the piano has very straight lines to it. So I'm using this triangle ruler tool to make sure that my lines are square to the edges of the canvas. So you just line it up along that one edge of the canvas so that you get that square line. Run your paintbrush along there as you need to. And then before you move the roller, you pick it up nice and straight and then wipe it off with a paper towel before you move it. Otherwise, you'll smear some paint around that you didn't mean to. So I just added a couple of little light and dark spots again on the pavement just to punch that up. It's time to sign it, call it done. Please remember to hit the like button if you like this video. And if you leave me a comment, I'll be sure to reply. Thanks so much for watching.